So what do you do when facts don't agree? When you have all these people in your tree and things just aren't lining up. What do you do then? That is what we're talking about today when we come back. Okay, so you have a bunch of people and documents and things are just not lining up. They just don't agree. So what do you do? Well, the two things that you need to do is called evidence analysis and correlation of evidence. So let's talk about those for a moment. Evidence analysis is when you take each individual document or piece of evidence within a document and you analyze it for how accurate it is. You kind of weigh it. Is it likely that this is factual, or is it likely that there could be an error in this? And we'll talk more about that in a moment. Then you have correlation of evidence. This is where you take all of the records that you have found, and you've done your reasonably exhaustive research by this point, and you are lining up the facts. So now you can take the weight of each of those documents and go, okay, these are lining up, but these aren't. These are less likely to be as accurate or whatever. So you kind of line up all of these documents and their facts within each of those documents. I don't know why we call them facts. It's really evidence within a document because at this point we're not sure it's factual, right? We're trying to resolve a conflict. And so this is the process that we use. So evidence analysis, each document individually, and correlation of evidence collectively. What story does the collective body of evidence tell us? Okay, let's talk about evidence for a moment. So evidence in itself is kind of a goofy term because some people think of evidence as the record. I think of evidence as the data within the record because you can have evidence of a birth and a death and a marriage all in one record, as we'll talk about here in a little bit with a death certificate. If we take a look at the definition of evidence, evidence is the available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. I mean, it's kind of vague. Is the evidence facts or is it not? Well, that's for us to determine, okay? So if we look at the proof definition, that is evidence or argument establishing or helping to establish a fact or the truth of a statement. So again, they kind of all go interchangeable, but we're trying to prove whether the evidence is correct or not, especially when we have conflicting evidence. Okay, so evidence analysis is this. So if we have a variety of documents, and at this point you should have done your reasonably exhaustive research, one of those doctrines of the Board for Certification of Genealogists, it is the first pillar, if you will, of what we do when we're doing quality level genealogy. And so we have gone out there and we found everything we could. This is just a simplified example. And we may find that the evidence or the data within these documents may not agree across all documents. This happens all the time, so don't think you're alone. Names aren't spelled the same. Birth dates might vary. You may have estimated years of birth on a census document, but then you might have an actual birth date on a death certificate. So which one is right? So we have to sit there and weigh all this evidence, and that's part of the evidence analysis process. So what I suggest you do is start with one ancestor at a time. And the reason I say this is because it can get way too complicated when you start trying to do everything at once and you're trying to focus on multiple people. I will have one little caveat to that is you might do the family unit. So the father, the mother, and the children. But the reality is, if you've done your research backwards as you should be, you've already done the children. So really the children in this scenario, are irrelevant because you've already done your reasonably exhaustive research on all the children of this ancestral couple. So it might be that we're working on the father and the mother. For the sake of argument, let's start with one person at a time and look at all the documents that we have for that one person. So one of the first things you need to do as we have collected our evidence, our records, right, and we know the one person that we are going to work on, is that we need to kind of decide, are all of these records primary records or secondary records? And what I mean by that is originals or copies. That's pretty much how you can determine whether these records carry a little more weight, because primary original documents will often carry more weight when we are evaluating each document individually. And then when we go to kind of start deducing, hey, is this fact, this conflicting fact that I'm trying to figure out, is it primary or secondary in these various documents, might help determine that. So as we start to analyze them, before we get into each individual document, which I'll give you some examples here in a second, we need to determine, of the records that we have, what do we have, primary or secondary? Or the secondary or copies, often referred to as derivative copies, meaning it's a copy of a document, it's a registry, it's some clerk had made a copy of a copy, So it could be that some of these documents are actually secondary documents. So here I am showing you land records, which is often a court document, which is going to carry a lot of weight because of the attention to detail that is needed when transferring land from one person to another. They're going to work very hard to make sure that those records are accurate. Same for a will. That is a court document. Marriage certificates. The reason why a marriage certificate is going to fall under the primary bucket is because it is often the marital couple who is giving the information, and so they have firsthand knowledge. In the secondary bucket, I have lumped together a variety of things here. A diploma is only as good as the person who filled it out. It could have been a front office person who typoed or something. An obituary is, again, going to have one or more people reporting on the death of a person, and the information may or may not be accurate. Bible information, we're going to get into that here, but a lot of times it's secondary. We'll see. Let's take a look at a Bible here in a few minutes, and we'll talk about what we find in it and how we can determine whether it's primary or secondary evidence within the record or the Bible. Census records, again, is taken by a census taker who knows who the informant was. In some cases, some census records give us that information, but in other cases, it does not. It just depends on the year whether they label the informant or not. It could be that the informant was the neighbor, was the 16-year-old child at home, and really didn't have that knowledge. The census, while it's a great record, not always accurate. A birth registry is a registry. See, I didn't want to fool you here. More than likely, if it's a birth certificate, it happens at the time of birth, but a birth registry is a list of names that come from other information somewhere else. So it could be that there's transcription errors there. Same goes for death certificate. Death certificates are kind of wonky because death certificates can have both primary and secondary evidence within the document. But if we're talking about documents, whether the primary or secondary evidence, on average, a death certificate is going to fall into that secondary bucket. Let's pretend for a moment that we're trying to solve for a death date. We have conflicting information about when a person died, and so we're going to take a look at all the evidence and do kind of a quick analysis here of what we have and how we can resolve this. So again, we've kind of taken our evidence and we've provided some of it to be under the primary bucket and some of it under the secondary bucket. Really, the only thing that matters here with regard to the death are just a few specific files. We have a will, and it is probated September 1887, but that is not the death date. It just says that the person is deceased and does not provide a death date. And the deceased signature is dated the first day of March in 1885. Okay. We're getting closer. So we have a deceased, the person who wrote the will, right? That person wrote that and signed it on the first day of March in 1885. And then it was probated in September of 1887. So somewhere between the 1st of March, 1885 and the September court filing, the probate in 1887. That is the range that we have for the death date. So we're getting closer, okay? Now we have an obituary, and the newspaper is dated the 14th of December, 1886, and it said he died last Saturday. So we could actually do the math and figure out, you know, what that date was, but this is secondary evidence, so how accurate is it? We have a Bible that doesn't really give us any information about the death date. It wasn't recorded in the Bible. We have a death certificate that says he died on the 11th of December, 1886. Now, let's take a look at the documents that only pertain to the conflict in which we are trying to solve for. And that is these three documents, okay? So we have two documents that are in the secondary bucket, one document in the primary bucket, but the primary document doesn't give us the exact death date. Now, the only time that we actually have information here is on the death certificate itself. Now, remember, when I was talking about death certificates, you can have mixed information. For example, the informant may have been the spouse and or a child. And so if in either situation, if it was a birth date that we were trying to solve for, they did not witness the event. And so they would not have personal knowledge. They probably have knowledge, but they weren't witness to the event. So they are considered a secondary source on a death certificate when talking about a birth event. But if this person had firsthand knowledge of the death date, perhaps even witnessed the death, they would have primary evidence within a death certificate about the death date. So in this case, the death certificate death date carries a lot of weight. And so does the newspaper, even though it's secondary evidence, because it now matches the death certificate. So we go back and look and do a little Google search. You can actually Google exactly when last Saturday was from December 14th. So in this case, the 14th of December in 1886 is a Tuesday. And doing the math backwards, it is December 11th on Saturday when the person died. So both of these documents in the secondary bucket are accurate. So you can have mixed evidence within the death certificate. In this case, the informant was the spouse, and they did have firsthand knowledge of the death date. They also had firsthand knowledge of the residency. So those two pieces of evidence or facts or data within that document is considered primary. The cause of death is also considered primary because the doctor is the one who wrote that information on the death certificate. Okay. Secondary information within that same death certificate would be the father's name of the person who died, the mother's maiden name, the father's place of birth, and the mother's place of birth. So all of those details that, while the wife might have had really good knowledge of this information, it's still considered secondary information within the death certificate. Okay, let's analyze a Bible record for a moment. Now, I realize you can't see this and it's way off to the side, but the reality is what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a lot of things, and some of it's not always everything written in the Bible as far as the names and the dates that are recorded here. So what you're looking at here is an old family Bible from my husband's side of the family about births. And this is just one page of many, okay? But one of the things we want to do is we want to think about, what do we know about this Bible? Where did it come from? Think of it as like a chain of custody. Who had it before you? Or if it's images that you have, where did you get them from? And so think about the chain of custody of this Bible, okay? So where did it come from? Who was the informant who wrote in this Bible? Right? Who is that person? Is it a grandmother? Is it your mother? Is it you? Is it who is it that is the informant? These are things that we need to think about when we're creating an analysis of an individual record. So what do we see? In this case, we see a lot. In fact, there are multiple pages of births, marriages, and deaths in this document. Is it in our possession or is it an image? And you should actually be creating notes about all of this information and create a cover sheet for the images that you are putting in your family history files. So who has it now? Has it been given to somebody else? And so that is part of that chain of custody. You want to transcribe it. Now, this particular one is a goldmine because there's just so much information packed in it. But we're going to kind of take a deeper look at it and kind of decipher some information about it. We're not going to get into all the details. I promise you, it's way too much. Let's talk about abstracting that information. So normally what we do is we transcribe exactly as we see it. In this case, it would probably go straight to an abstract unless there was some narrative or something written in it or some extra information found within the pages. Sometimes you find documents, lockets of hair, I mean, all kinds of things, cards, gift cards, that kind of thing that you might find in the pages within the Bible. So you want to abstract that information into your research notes for each ancestor. That's a lot of work. Notice the handwriting. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but the handwriting is really important in a family Bible. Take a picture of the front matter, and this is for not only for your source information, but sometimes it helps you date the Bible, because dating the book or the Bible in this case helps you determine when the information within it was written. In this case, there is a page where it was presented to Mrs. Mamie Knox from H.W. Knox. And there is a date there that says August 17th, 1906. And I realize my slide is kind of running off the screen there, but you get the idea. Okay, so this is information. This is great information. This book was given H.W. Knox's wife, Mamie Knox, on the 17th of August, 1906. Well, looking at the family history, I found that this was just a month or two before their third child was born. Sometimes there's a date event. Sometimes it is given, a Bible is given to a couple at marriage. So it just depends, but sometimes you can find an event that is tied to the date that it was presented. Okay, so here is kind of an inside look at this very old Bible. Is well over 100 years old at this point, and it has a lot of information in it. Now, there's not quite as many marriages, but there's certainly a lot of births, and there is a ton of death information in here as well. And you can tell that people over the years had taped it together to kind of try and hold it together because it is very fragile. Okay, so we know this information. Part of our chain of custody is that it was at one point in the possession of H.W. Knox. His name was Henry Walter Knox, and he gave it to his wife, Mamie Knox. Knowing the date that it was given to us, all of the dates that we find in this Bible that were before the 1906 date, we have to think about that information came after. So when we're evaluating the evidence within this Bible, we are going, okay, here we have an 1879 date, an 1884, 1902, 1904, 1905 dates that were long after the fact, that were written into this Bible prior to the book being gifted from husband to wife. So we have to take that information with a grain of salt. Does whoever wrote this, probably Mamie Knox, whoever wrote this, did she write it from memory? Did she have other knowledge? Did she have it in another piece of paper? Whatever it is, it's secondary information. So she could have a faulty memory when she was writing this stuff down. Okay? Something else we need to keep in mind is the handwriting. So we were talking about evaluating documents and handwriting earlier, and this is where we pick up. So when we're evaluating handwriting, it becomes part of our analysis because ink that is in the same hand, in the same ink, same pressure, you can tell when different pens were being used were likely written at different times. You also want to evaluate the dates. So large sections of this page were probably written all at the same time. Now, whether she had a scrap of paper somewhere or was running around at a family reunion and asking people, when were you born, blah, 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 and putting it in, we don't know. What we do know is what we have here. And we can tell that certain parts of this information were written at the same time. So as you can see, I've kind of outlined different sections of this Bible that were likely written at the time. So what you want to do is you want to take the last date. In this case, this little box here says 1916. Therefore, this 1914 date might be from memory, because this may have been written right after the event of 1916. Same goes for here, same goes for here, same goes for here. All of these dates, you really kind of want to look at the last date and go, okay, this was written after this box of information. There may be multiple things within that box that you can tell were all written at the same time. And it could be that that was written not long after the last event dated in that box. Does that make sense? I hope so. Long story short, these are the kind of things that you need to be thinking about when you're analyzing documents, because we need to really pay attention to all of those little nuances that could have a factor on whether how much weight we give it. Is that really a valid date? This 1884 date was written long after the Bible was given or gifted. And so it was a derivative information. It could have been copied out of another Bible. We don't know. But when we are analyzing our documents, we have to be thinking about the informants, the information given, what do we know about this document, all of that. Bibles are great information, and a lot of times they're very accurate, but sometimes they're not. So we just have to be careful when we are, trying to say this is absolute fact when we might find out later that the Bible may be incorrect. But boy, this one's a jewel. I love it. So long story short, you need to go through that same analysis process for all of the documents that you find for that one ancestor that you're trying to solve for. And make sure that you are comparing those facts from one document to another. Make sure you're looking at only the documents that pertain to the research question at hand at that moment. Now, you should also be looking at the spouse as well, because there may be evidence or records that are specific to that spouse that do not show up in the husband, in this case. You might want to find those other records because there may be more evidence to find. And there may be some in the children's records as well. So you do need to kind of expand your horizon there. Make sure you found everything you can. But long story short, once you start comparing those documents and you start weighing the evidence that you have, and you start going, okay, wait a minute, this date came from the Bible and it was written long before the Bible was gifted. So it could be that that date is wrong when I have another piece of evidence here that shows that this date is probably more likely. So this is how you weigh the evidence. This is how it's done. Evidence analysis and correlation of evidence. Those are the two things. We talk about it all the time at the Genealogy TV Academy. If you want to get hooked up with the Genealogy TV Academy, there is a link somewhere here on the screen. And we'll catch you in the next video. There are more videos on the screen as well for your binge watching pleasure. We'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.